who weren't able to. Oh, and we're going to record the meeting. We're going to record this so that we can share the knowledge that Johann is sharing with us wider. We won't record the Q&A at the end. Um, so uh, the report's been was released in March, and uh, we're really excited to bring you this session today. The report is uh, based on the significant thought leadership and work of Dr. Johann Go. We're really lucky to have Johann on our team remotely from afar in the UK, where he is a professor or assistant professor and lecturer, specializing in health and politics and ethics. So I will hand over to Dr. Johann Go and just acknowledge that he's done an incredible piece of work for us in creating this State of the Decade report, and also over the last 6 years working on our previous reports and really strengthening I guess, the research kudos of our State of Volunteering reports altogether. Please welcome Dr. Johann Go.
Great. Kia ora, everyone, and thank you very much, Michelle. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that, it's really nice to be able to keep working on issues in New Zealand, and in volunteering in particular. So I moved to the UK nearly 10 years ago, but I grew up in the Hutt Valley, and so a lot of my connections can be kept alive through a lot of my work with VNZ, which I do enjoy. And so it's always a nice feeling to be able to share some of these insights. So, in this session, we're not going to assume that you've read the state of volunteering. So, this is basically going to be a summary of all the key insights that we've highlighted based on the reports that have come out over the past 10 years, both through Stats New Zealand as well as our own reports in VNZ. But I guess the first question is, why are we bothering with the state of the decade? Well, there's been quite a lot of demographic changes in New Zealand in those 10 years, from the ethnocultural makeup of New Zealand through to various workforce changes. And these have important implications for volunteering rates. So it's an interesting way to look at how these have an impact on volunteering. There have also been lots of social and political changes, different political parties, different prime ministers, different kinds of social priorities, the rise of social media and AI, and so on. And these again have a important effect on how we see volunteering unfold. We've had major events from the Christchurch terror attacks through to the White Island volcanic eruptions, all these major events that again influence how volunteering is done, with many volunteers being at the forefront of the response to these events. It's also useful to think about what the past decade has been like because it's a useful snapshot into the future of volunteering and what we can expect volunteering to look like maybe in the next 10 years. And more generally, there were important lessons and opportunities to be drawn from these. And so, as we'll see, many of the comments from the sector over the past 10 years give us some really useful advice and really useful cautionary notes about what to say and what to do when we look to the next 10 years of volunteering. It's also increasingly important to understand the context in which volunteering takes place. And what we mean by this is, for example, understanding the personal dimension of volunteering. So we know that people are more likely to volunteer to a cause that's linked to them on a personal level. For example, you might volunteer for an organization that's helped your family or that helps someone you know struggling with that disease or that cause. There are economic influences on volunteering. So we know that the cost of living pressures across the world have had a huge impact on volunteering. People might think twice about giving their time volunteering when they could pick up a part-time job or a second job, for example. And so when times are tough, we know that people volunteer less. And because, they have to think about putting food on the table or they have to think about the economic consequences. There are also political contexts that we have to think about. So the language around volunteering, the policies, that charities and NGOs have to work within, these again make it easier or harder for volunteers to be recruited and onboarded. There are also social impacts. So over the past 10 years, but also beyond that, there is so much more to do in terms of leisure. The rise of everything from Disney Plus to Netflix. We use this as an example, right? The Netflix effect is a known phenomenon in the volunteering literature where the fact that there is more entertainment now than ever means that people are volunteering less because, for example, they can entertain themselves in other ways. So it's not to say that volunteering is going all the way down, but these are the kinds of things that might influence people to make different volunteering decisions. And there's also cultural impacts. So different cultures might have different attitudes to volunteering. We know the concept of mahi aroha within Maoridom, for example, has a different meaning and different understanding for what it means within how we measure volunteering in statistics, for example. So these are just the general kind of context that we have to care about when we think about volunteering. The main insight, though, is that volunteering over the past decade has changed in various forms. It's not that it's decreased, actually. In fact, we'll see from the official stats that it's actually increased for the most part. But the form it's taken has changed. Overall, we also see that the voluntary sector remains strong and resilient. So we see the ability for the sector as a whole to bounce back and to respond to changes in both policy and social context. You also see that volunteers and volunteering involving organizations are really the backbone that supports the success of the sector. So it's the unpaid workers, the volunteer labor, and the volunteers, commitment that is really driving the strength of the sector. But there's also ongoing challenges that we need to be aware of as we look to the future. And so in this report, we look at both the lessons as well as the opportunities that we can learn from going into the future. Our aim is to draw on basically the past 10 years of data insights from various sources to come up with insights that can help us. So we've done this through quantitative surveys. We've looked at these are through some of our own in-house surveys, both qualitative and quantitative. We've ran focus groups with volunteers and volunteer managers from a wide range of organizations, including some of the biggest organizations in New Zealand. We've also consulted Stats New Zealand's population level statistics on volunteering, for example, through the General Social Survey and other data sets. The main thing, though, is we've reviewed 10 years of the state of volunteering reports. So the state of volunteering has been going for several years, and the aim is to look back and see if there are trends. Now, these reports have been done in various formats. I didn't take over this report until 2019, but since then we've seen that there are various ways in which we can see volunteering changing. And so we still find a useful snapshot into how the sector has changed over time. So here's one simple graphic that illustrates the current rates of volunteering. And this is taken from Stats New Zealand's General Social Survey. So we can be very confident in the accuracy of this data. So when we looked at the latest 2025 update based on the 2023 General Social Survey, 53.0% of people volunteered over the previous 4 weeks. So that's over half of the population in New Zealand who volunteer. About 27%, so 27.6% exactly, of those volunteers volunteer through an organization, while 40.8% of people who volunteer do so directly. So they don't do it through an organization, they help someone out directly. Now, this is an increase of 2.3% percentage points over the previous period. So these are the total numbers of people who volunteer. It was 50.7% in the previous update, and this is now 2.3 percentage points higher. So again, we see that the volunteering has actually increased, not decreased. So among those who volunteered, as I mentioned, 27.6% did this for an organization and 40.8% directly for another person. And what we see is that those who volunteered through an organization has decreased compared to 2021. So it was previously 30.2. Now we see that only 27.6% volunteer directly, so volunteer through an organization. Instead, we see an increase in those who are volunteering directly, so not going through an organization. So this could be, for example, helping your neighbor out directly, helping a close friend directly without going through an organization. And so it's an increase from 36% to 40.8%. And this, just as an aside, is why maybe there's a kind of mismatch when the sector says that, volunteers are dropping. What they're likely noticing is that we're seeing a decrease in volunteers who volunteer through organizations and through traditional ways. Instead, these people are opting to volunteer in more direct and personal ways. So I guess we can say that it's a decade of transformation. There's more people volunteering, but they're volunteering in different kinds of patterns. And so we see a clear shift towards, more flexible, episodic volunteering, where it's more task-based, shorter commitments, and more choice over how volunteering is done when and where and how much. We've also seen this idea of the changing civic core. So, for those not familiar, the civic core is this theory in volunteering that the majority or the lion's share of volunteering is done by a very small minority of volunteers. And a lot of organizations would report that they had a civic core, a small group of very, very active volunteers who did, 80 or 90% of the organization's volunteering. But we're seeing this really shift. In many cases, we're now seeing a much broader base of people who are contributing smaller and more regular amounts, but spread out across a wider range and group of people. And this has been a major change over the past decade. So the core, there's a core group of people that volunteer a lot. And this has been shrinking actually. So what we're seeing is it's being replaced by people who are more active but flexible. So they do bits here and there, but who still make up a significant portion of an organization's volunteering workforce. This idea of the changing civic core is something that is really an important shift when we look at the past 10 years. Again, as I said, it's a highly influential model. The mainstream view is that volunteering is done by this tiny group of people, and it's been traditionally seen that we need to prioritize those within the civic core. But recent population level data, both from Stats New Zealand and from our own research in VNZ, shows that this model is actually changing and that the shifting civic core is actually being diversified. We're seeing many more volunteers in various areas, in various capacities, engaging in volunteering. So here is another useful chart to look at the volunteers by the number of hours they contributed over the previous 4 weeks. So in formal terms, the distribution of volunteering hours is roughly bimodal. And what that means is there are two kind of peaks. We have a lot of people, there's a large number of people who contribute a few hours a month, so less than 5 hours a month, alongside a large number of people who contribute 25 plus. So what we're seeing is these kind of two peaks. People are either doing a little bit here and there or a lot. And there are a lot of people who volunteer in these two peaks. And what we see is a kind of trough in the middle. So there are fewer people who contribute between 10 and 25 hours per month. And this again challenges that civic core view, where the bulk of volunteering used to be carried out by a small proportion of volunteers. What we're seeing with this bimodal distribution is that volunteering hours are being much, is much more spread out across the board. And so we're seeing a broader base of volunteers who are helping out with these tasks. Another useful insight is that average volunteering has increased to 18.5 hours per 4 weeks compared to the previous period. So that's about 1 hour per week of volunteering more per week compared to the 2016 data, for example. Whereas the most common contribution remains under 5 hours in a 4 week period. So the most common amount of volunteering people do is to do under 5 hours in a 4 week period. So again, it's this casualization of volunteering. And of this group, we see about 32.5% of people volunteering for less than 5 hours over the previous 4 weeks. When we look at the gender balance of the volunteering, we know that around 55.9% of volunteers are women and 50.0%, sorry, let me rephrase that. So we know that 55.9% of women volunteer, I should say, and roughly 50% of men volunteer. And so it's always been the case that there has been a slightly higher percentage of women who volunteer than men within the general population. And this is a 5.9 percentage point difference between men and women who volunteer. Here is another useful chart when we look at what's the age group of people who are volunteering. So when we look at, for example, people who are aged 15 to 24, 45.8% of people in this age group volunteered over the previous 4 weeks. When we look at the most active group in volunteering, those aged between 45 and 64, 59.3% of people in this group volunteer. And this reflects some of the challenges and the expectations that organizations have around who's volunteering in the space in New Zealand. We've seen a growth in the number of organizations who are reporting that aging volunteers is one of the biggest challenges they're facing. So in 2018, when this early report came out, 25% of organizations reported that aging volunteers were a concern. When we look at the most recent report in 2024, we find that 49.8% of organizations in New Zealand report that aging volunteers is their biggest concern. So this is nearly a doubling of those who report volunteering of aging volunteers as among their biggest concerns, simply from 2018. So there's data from earlier then, but we've decided not to include it because there was a slightly different methodology for how that was measured. But this really shows the kind of concerns around aging volunteers and what we've heard from the sector time and time again. So we've seen this, as I said, reflected across the decade. But why is it a problem? Well, one problem is a simple problem of representation. So aging volunteers mean that there's less representation of volunteers across other age groups. There are fewer youth volunteers, there are fewer people across the life course who might be able to contribute insights and connect with particular service users. But there's also a problem around succession planning. So aging volunteers mean that there is no future pipeline of volunteers or volunteer leaders for that organization. So these twin problems of both representation and succession planning means that aging volunteers can be an important challenge for the sector as a whole. One complaint that we've seen throughout the decade is this concern around the burdens of compliance and regulation. So a lot of organizations complain about red tape and how it's important, on the one hand, to have regulations to protect volunteers, but at the same time, it can be really burdensome and costly to have all these kinds of regulations. And so there's an important balance to be struck there. So a lot of volunteers, for example, talk about the challenges of conducting police checks or the health and safety regulations that have to be met for each of their buildings. There's also a lot of regulatory reporting by managers. So they note how much time it takes to complete paperwork to comply with regulations and with the requirements of financial reporting and so on. But volunteers, on the other hand, appreciate and understand the importance of these regulations. So many volunteers understand the issue that managers are facing, but they also really appreciate the kinds of safety that is being that is promoted through having these stronger safeguards and regulations. The past decade has also seen a big professionalization of the sector. So Volunteering is now being seen as an activity that requires training and professional standards. Um, in the past, there was this idea that volunteers are simply unpaid amateurs. But we're seeing that this is now being challenged. There's now much more training available for volunteers. There's much more training available to managers of volunteers. And there's much more of an appreciation that volunteers often come from all walks of life with unique skills, both from their professional work and from their personal insights to offer. And in fact, Volunteering New Zealand has published its own best practice guidelines, which are tools that are available on the website to try and look at what it is that would make the sort of best practice guidelines around being a volunteer. Everything from how to successfully onboard volunteers to how to successfully conduct exit interviews, for example. And so this realization that volunteers have this kind of professional side as well, it's really becoming a stronger aspect of the sector's awareness. The sector has also shown a lot of resilience over the past decade. So we've seen lots of major events and crises, including, natural disasters, violent occasions like the Christchurch terror attacks, the COVID pandemic, and also ongoing economic crises and the cost of living crisis, which has really, as I said, impacted on the motivations around volunteering. What we've found in each of these cases is that volunteers were often at the forefront of responding to these events. So volunteers stepped up and provide services. So during COVID, we saw a lot of volunteers help out in the health sector. They everything from looking after babysitting for doctors who were working on the front line to themselves volunteering on the front line, whether distributing PPE, running volunteer food banks, or even volunteering in the emergency services. And what we see is that sector leaders consistently lead from the front in a professional and resilient way. Um, and in some ways, how the sector has responded to the recent crises is a good example of the strength and the resilience that we've shown over the past decade. So, since the first SOV report, Volunteering New Zealand has run this thing known as the State of Volunteering metric. And we basically use it as a very rough rule of thumb, asking people to rate the state of volunteering in New Zealand out of 10, with 1 or 0 being very weak and 10 being extremely strong. And we use this, as I said, as a rough guide of how the volunteering sector is doing. We've seen that scores have stayed relatively constant throughout, and in fact, the 10-year average is 6.5. But this gives us a general view of the sector. Now, you might say it's remained stagnant, it hasn't increased, but also you can frame this in a positive way, which is despite all the challenges being faced by the sector, increased demands on services, ongoing crises, we've managed to retain a very strong rating in the state of volunteering. So, if we were to look forward to the next decade of volunteering, what would that look like? And what are the insights that we can extrapolate from what has come over the past 10 years? Well, observations about digital transformation are important. So in 2015, for example, 45.6% of organizations reported that they use digital tools. In 2024, nearly 10 years later, that's 49.4. And so that means that that's a tiny increase in the numbers of organizations who are using digital technology. It's likely that the advent of AI and other digital innovation will accelerate even faster in the coming decades. And this means that organizations that don't innovate in the digital sphere are likely to be left behind. And so these rates, likely for the sector, need to be rapidly scaled up. The changing nature of work and leisure also is something that offers both challenges and opportunities. So we know that the advent of hybrid working, people staying at home, has also had an impact on formal volunteering. So, one reason why people are volunteering less with organizations and volunteering more directly is partly because of the post-COVID move to hybrid working. So, people are more likely to be at home to help out their neighbors and to help out directly in their community compared to, for example, volunteering in an organization that is near the place of work in the city center. And so it's an example of how this changing nature of work has important flow-on effects of volunteering. And we've got evidence that if this continues, especially over the next decade, that could have an even more profound impact on how we see the nature of volunteering. Perhaps this move away from formal or organizational volunteering to more direct and informal volunteering. A few weeks ago, Volunteering New Zealand also ran a survey, just an informal survey, which we will put up the QR link for you guys to do, which is to get feedback from the sector about the State of the Decade report, as well as your own views about the future of volunteering. What do you most fear? What do you most look forward to? And so on. One thing that was quite clear was that respondents seemed to think that the report aligned very well with their experiences. And many actually said that the report's quite nice because it confirms these personal insights in an official way. So for a lot of people in the sector, it wasn't news as such. It was just nice to have what was already something they were experiencing confirmed through an official report. And in fact, what we also find is that a large proportion of sector leaders have not had a chance to read the SOV report yet, the State of the Decade report. And this is partly why we run these webinars, so that people who are very busy, um, as many of you will be in the volunteering sector, these webinars give us an opportunity to deliver just the core insights in a bite-sized way and to offer this kind of opportunity to ask us further questions. We also know that the State of Volunteering reports, including the State of the Decade report, are widely used for advocacy. And so many organizations report that they're using these insights to campaign, with their local MPs, with government partners, and so on. Many organizations, especially those in more isolated rural areas, also said it's encouraging that their local experiences are actually reflected nationally. And so, in some ways, it was a kind of solidarity, a kind of sign of solidarity that others are also experiencing these similar challenges. And all of this, again, what's really reassuring for us is there's a strong alignment with the findings of the state of volunteering and the lived experiences of volunteers and organizations. So we're seeing that many people and many volunteers find that their experiences are reflected in the findings of our report. And that for us is a good sign in the sense that it captures both what's happening on the ground, and it also gives us a way in which these experiences can be made more official and used in the context of advocacy and so on. So that is just a very basic high-level outline of the report. The report is available on Volunteering New Zealand's website. But I'll also open the floor in a moment for any questions, which I'll be happy to take. So thank you very much. I'll hand back over to Michelle.